So I think if Donald Trump and his team really examine these 4 points, I think there's a solution here. If you reach a point when Russia lose this war, Russia will resort to
Welcome to the Game of Impossible podcast. My name is Leon and this is my dad, Idris Jala. We are a father-son podcast where we discuss all things transformation through the lens of business, leadership, sport, and faith. One of the hallmarks of leadership that we often talk about is the ability to win coalitions. It is secret number 5 in your arsenal of the 6 secrets of transformation, winning coalitions, i.e. the ability to influence. And I think to be able to make friends, essentially, to make friends in order to achieve your true north. I think the biggest folly that we see today of an inability to do this well is just the state that we're in geopolitically. We have the war in Ukraine, Israel and Palestine as well, and so I think those are real examples of just leadership failures. Leadership failures in the area of diplomacy. And I think we have talked about this in previous episodes, an inability to compromise. While we're talking about warfare, I think maybe today we have seen the situation in Russia and Ukraine has escalated in the advent of Trump taking office. And so with that, maybe let's today hone in a little bit more specifically on Russia and Ukraine. Where have you observed the leadership failures here?
The Ukraine and the Russian war, to my mind, it's caused and triggered by 4 leadership failures. The first one, if you take it from the perspective of the Russians, this is the perspective of the Russian. After the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991, it was very clear that the Cold War has ended simply because, in some sense, Russia was defeated. And so the bipolar world that comprised 2 superpowers, that mean the US and Russia, a Soviet Union at the time, one had collapsed and the other became it became at that point unipolar world. That means dominated by the US. But at that time, everyone had given the assurance. They told them that don't worry, with the collapse of the Soviet Union, NATO will not move an inch. This was an assurance given by James Baker, the United Nations Secretary of State.
What happened to that?
What happened to that? Subsequently, almost all the Eastern Bloc, they became part of NATO. So from the eyes of the Russians, the rest of the leadership, I mean, when I say NATO leadership and US leadership, these are people like the guys who are at fault here as Bill Clinton, the failure of Bill Clinton, Blair, Jacques Chirac from France, Gerald Schroeder from Germany, and subsequently Bush. All of them did not honor the verbal agreement that they assured Russia that they would not move an inch. So they really went. So when you think about it from the perspective of the Russians, you have given us this assurance, and you have completely ignored it, completely rejected it, completely conveniently forgotten about it. Every single step along the way, we reminded you not to do it, but you kept on doing it. So in here, it's very clear there was a failure of the NATO and US leadership to comply and honor the assurance that they gave to the Russians. At that point, when you think about it, why would the Russians feel so threatened? If you really look at United States of America, in 1823, the President Monroe come out with this treaty they call it the Monroe Doctrine. The Monroe Doctrine was America was threatened in case the rest of the European powers encroach into somewhere near America. So they said to them, you guys in Europe, please don't come over anywhere near in the Western Hemisphere, that means the Americas, anywhere near it. And if you don't come anywhere near, because we feel threatened when you do, to reciprocate, we will not go and encroach into your territory in Europe.
Right.
That was the Monroe Doctrine. You can see already the Americans were fearful of anybody from Europe coming to annex any place near to where they are. They have this thing called Monroe Doctrine. If you have Monroe Doctrine that governs your fear and control it, you should understand why the Russians were very fearful of the expansion of NATO closer and closer and closer to Russia. Because it was exactly the same fear that they had enshrined under the Monroe Doctrine. So that's the failure number one.
Yeah.
The failure number one. Let me talk about failure number two. Now I want to talk about this from the eyes of Ukraine. From the eyes of Ukraine. The Ukrainians are saying, you guys at NATO, the leadership at NATO, plus Putin at that time and the USA, they all agreed, if you dismantle Ukraine, you dismantle your nuclear armaments, you dismantle all of that. Don't worry, we'll give you all the assurance. We will not invade you. We will not give you any trouble. So they complied. So when they complied, and that was what they called, they signed the Budapest Agreement in 1994. When they signed the Budapest Agreement, as soon as they signed, Ukraine dismantled their nuclear armament. Yeah. Now they have dismantled it. Of course, they're worried that will actually these guys come in and assist them. So of course they are very, very worried. That's why they want to be part of NATO.
Yeah.
That's because they don't have the nuclear armament. So to me, from their standpoint, Ukraine is saying, you have sold us out down the river because you got us to sign the Budapest Agreement in 1994 on the condition that when we remove our nuclear armaments, we will be given the protection. None of that is fulfilled. So this is the failure of, if you like, very specifically, I would say, the failure of US, specifically the UK and Russia. All three parties were the guys who really were behind the Budapest Agreement in 1994. And none of them fulfilled it. They totally ignored it. Of course, Russia invading Ukraine was the ultimate thing to go and do that. So that's a failure, if you like. The NATO leadership in the USA and Putin himself to honor the Budapest Agreement. So that's failure number two. I would now say failure number three. Failure number three is Putin's failure, is inability to find a diplomatic means to convince NATO and the US leadership that the expansion of NATO into Ukraine is an existential threat to Russia. And he has not been able to convince them. And if he tried hard, must find different ways to convince them, rather than just kept it like that, thinking that they will have the armaments to do it when they wanted to do it. So I think, but to be fair to him, there was one thing that they did. When they decided in 2014 to invade Crimea, that's Russia, invade Crimea and annex it to become part of Russia, he was sending a clear signal to NATO, I am prepared to do what it takes to protect my country, and if it means to come and invade Russia, I will do it. But I'm giving you a signal. But the rest of the leadership in NATO, including USA, they poo-pooed it. They never took it seriously. And so that was the failure, in my mind, is failure of Putin on his part to really convince, through many, many ways, to convince NATO leadership in America and the rest of the leadership that he meant business. And so that was his failure. I think the fourth failure, the failure of leaders of Ukraine and Russia, this is now both Ukraine and Russia, the failure to honor the Minsk II agreement. So the Minsk II agreement was signed by Russia and Ukraine in 2015. Under this agreement, they said because of the fighting, the conflict that was taking place in the Donbas area, specifically in Donetsk and Luhansk, they said, let's sign an agreement. By this agreement, by December 2015, Ukraine government will make changes in their Ukrainian constitution to allow for decentralization of power, to then allow for relative autonomy to the Donbas region.
Sarawak.
a bit like Sarawak lah. What they're doing, what they're trying to do in Sarawak is to try to say that we are still part of Malaysia, but in the case of Sarawak, they want independence when it comes down to education. They want independence over public health.
Yeah.
So they wanted some independence in those areas specifically. And closer to another area that took place like that is the example of what has happened in Zanzibar. When they became independent, and Tanzania, that Julius Nyerere, when he became the president, he knew that if he insists on making sure that Zanzibar become part of Tanzania, just like the rest of Tanzania, it will become, they will break off, just like Singapore and Malaysia. So what he then did was he agreed that Zanzibar can become independent. They have their own president. And Julius Nyerere became the independent Tanzania. And so, but some areas they have autonomy and some areas they don't have autonomy. So that was how they were able to coexist. And so this idea of relative autonomy can actually happen. And the point was this: in 2015, both Ukraine and Russia actually signed an agreement for that to happen.
Exactly.
It's called the Minsk II agreement.
Yeah.
And they did it. So I would say it's the failure of the leadership in Ukraine and Russia to honor that agreement that they signed. Because if they did sign that, if in particular, if Ukraine had made it happen, because they were supposed to, by December 2015, to make the change in the constitution. If the change on constitution has happened, that devolution of power would have happened, that war would not have happened.
Yeah.
So that's a failure on that part. But because they didn't do that, the Donbas separatist conflict raged on as a war, like a proxy war between Russia and Ukraine. In fact, the Malaysia Airlines plane was shot down by because of what is happening in that area, that particular area. So I would say today, in my mind, I will argue very forcefully here, Leon, that the Ukraine and the Russian war, the current Ukraine-Russian war, is catapulted or triggered by these 4 leadership failures. And by the way, Leon, there were many, many people that had predicted this to happen. People like Professor John Mearsheimer and many others had said this was heading on to a war that will take place. And it was very clear, they predicted that until and unless the leaders of these countries come together and forge a new solution to end it, it's heading towards that direction. It will reach into a war. And that's what we have today.
Yeah, so I mean, all of that is underpinned by, like what you mentioned, I think ultimately a lack of, people were not honoring the end of the deal because there seemed to be a lack of enforcement, especially with NATO. You would expect NATO to be the referees of these agreements and of these deals. But there's obviously a lack of enforcement, a lack of clarity as well. I just reminded of what Winston Churchill said about diplomacy, and he described diplomacy as the art of diplomacy is the art of telling another person to go to hell, which results in the other person asking you for directions to it. I would maybe argue that it's not good enough to just ask them to go to hell and for them to ask you for directions. Actually, it's to ask them to go to hell and provide the directions. And I think in this case, there weren't the right guardrails and directions in place to ensure that people will hold their end of the deal. So what do you think are some enforcements that maybe international bodies could have applied or could apply moving forward?
Well, I mean, at that point, the issue was very simple. They did not put this thing in writing. It was a verbal agreement between them. Yeah. And at that time, I can imagine in Russia, they were so worried about the collapse of USSR at that time. And they were just concerned about that rather than getting in writing all these agreements. So it was an agreement. It was repeated so many times amongst the leaders. Everyone gave assurance to one another, but they just didn't put in an agreement. So, of course, the enforcement does not happen because you didn't have an agreement. Right. But that said, Leon, all the other things I talked about, they were agreements. Yeah. The Budapest agreement, the Minsk agreement, they still didn't do it. So it comes down to leadership. Because here, the problem is integrity. And in leadership, you must have integrity. When you say it, you mean it. And when you say you mean it, you make it happen and you honor it. This is the point when they said it, they didn't mean it, they didn't do it, they didn't honor it. That's why they're so full of mistrust.
Yeah, so but exactly why I asked about enforcement, because gone are the days where you can rely on the reliability or integrity of one's word.
This
one's
is it.
word, one's handshake even
Absolutely.
is not good enough. So things need to be in writing. But like you said, even with the agreements that you mentioned that were in writing, still things weren't honored. So you can on both sides you can almost you can sometimes understand why they have had to resort to warfare. I'm just thinking right now. There's a lot of talk on what does Trump taking office mean now for the current situation? Do you think that he will have? Do you think that he will be able to bring a deal to Putin?
Well, Trump is larger than life. He declared that he will end it in one day. He said he will end it in one day. Well, the jury is out.
Yeah.
I don't believe he will end it in one day. I mean, he was doing it. It's a campaign stunt.
Yeah.
There's no way he will end it in one day. But I do hope that he and his guys out there in his administration do seriously look for a solution to mediate this. And I think it's rife. The opportunity is there for striking a deal that will do it. So I do believe one way or another, Trump winning White House is seen by Russia as they're having an upper hand. And I believe that they're having an upper hand, then therefore, at least he wants to talk. The problem before was Biden administration, they've already said no. They're not talking to Putin. So when you end the opportunity to have diplomacy, a dialogue to find a solution, you will not find it. And that's why Jeffrey Sachs is kept on saying the problem with the world today is that the leaders, they have just broken all the bridges for mediation through diplomacy. They just want to allow war to take place. From many people who are hawkish in America, they don't mind the war to continue because it's going to weaken Russia, it's going to demolish and weaken Ukraine, but then they remain pretty and strong. But of course, when you see it as it is today, what is happening as a result of the consequence of this war is that China is teaming up with Russia, and so is Iran as well, and so is North Korea. You can see the geopolitical alliances taking place here, and this is not good. And so I do worry about how this war is going to end, where it's going to lead to.
While you're talking about that, let's play out some scenarios. Maybe scenario one.
Okay.
If Russia wins, what does that mean for us, even here in Malaysia?
So if Russia wins, obviously, Russia is going to claim the Donbas region. Luhansk and Donetsk, in Crimea, they said, belongs to us. They've already won the war, so therefore we want to take this. And they will also insist that NATO must put in writing in an agreement that NATO will not expand into Ukraine. So that's the condition when Russia wins. The other scenario is that the unlikely scenario when Ukraine wins. If Ukraine wins,
highly unlikely.
If Ukraine were to win this war, that means Russia loses. The problem with that, in my view, is that if you reach a point when Russia loses this war, Russia will resort to nuclear war. This is very, very bad for the world. Bad for Ukraine, bad for Russia, bad for the rest of us, actually. So the unlikely scenario when Russia loses is that they will then move towards nuking. This is very bad. And I hope that, God forbid, it will ever happen. And the third scenario, which I believe is more likely going to happen, in what I call intermittent, or in what John Mearsheimer called frozen conflict. But I changed it. He called it frozen conflict. But I think,
what do you call it?
I call it intermittent because it cannot be totally frozen. Because I do believe, like the MCO that we had before, you have lockdown, you have opened the economy, and you have the lockdown. So there will be ceasefire, between the two. But because there's this ceasefire, there is no permanent agreement. Because there's no permanent agreement, what will happen is that Russia will gain the Donbas region, but they gain it, but not legitimately. They will govern it. It become part of them, but it's illegal. It's exactly what happened to Crimea. Crimea is still, as far as the Ukraine is concerned, still belong to them. But as far as the Russians are concerned, they are governing it, they are running it. So I think that's frozen or the intermittent conflict is likely to happen.
It reminds me a bit of that. I don't know if you ever watched the movie The Purge.
I didn't watch that one.
So the basic premise of this film was that there's this, it's in this world where crime has been brought down to virtually zero. That there is no strife. It's like a perfect society. But then the dark secret as to why this society, this economy has been able to run like that is because every year, once a year, they run this thing called the annual purge.
Oh, I see.
Once a year, you're allowed to do anything. You're allowed to kill each other.
Terrible.
And whatever you have done in that window, you get away scot-free.
Just for that period.
So it's a little bit like what I suppose you're saying.
Yeah.
So this idea of this intermittent approach supposes that we agree to peace, but we allow some pockets for you to have some skirmishes here and there to get it out of your system, and then we go back to having a period or a window of peace.
But this intermittent and frozen conflict, however describe it, is exactly what happened with the two-state solution, the Israel and Palestinian.
Yeah.
It doesn't work.
Yeah.
It's actually very bad. It will
But how
be
do
like
you
that.
actually
And so
govern something like that?
It's very,
how do
very-
you draw the boundaries for...
It's very difficult because there's no agreement.
Exactly.
So there will be skirmishes. It's going to be permanently having problem. I really believe that the scenario 2 or scenario 1, they come together and really find a solution. I think I have some ideas what they might do.
Okay, what do you think?
I think there are 4 solutions to it, the way forward. But it requires transformational leadership. If Putin really can demonstrate it and bring forth Keir Starmer and others to come to way, and United Nations come together, some people like that form a kind of triumvirate that they come together to mediate it. And so bring some expert interlocutors to help them mediate it. So the solutions are twofold. One, NATO give a full assurance that they will not expand into Ukraine. This is exactly in line with the original agreement that they said verbally before by
Maybe
James
they can hire
Buchanan and
PEMANDU
Inch.
to help them to hardwire the deal.
Hardwire the deal. So that's one. And why do I think they are going to agree with this? Because they said that was what they wanted to do right from beginning. NATO said they're not going to move an inch. Just do it. You agreed and you told Russia long before that that was not going to happen. So the fact that you've already annexed, you've taken most of the Eastern Bloc countries into NATO, okay, that's by and by. But now, just don't go into Ukraine. That's all. That one. Number 2, Russia gives full and unequivalent assurance that they will not invade Ukraine. That's it. They will stop invading Ukraine. That's point number 2. Point number 3, Ukraine, to fulfill point 11 of the Minsk II agreement, which was signed in 2015, that allowed for relative autonomy given to the Donbas region, specifically Donetsk and Luhansk. Under this agreement, Ukraine was supposed to change their constitution to allow for decentralization of power, to allow for relative autonomy. So all they needed to do was take the original agreement, the Minsk II agreement, reinsert that into the new agreement and said, we've agreed this before between Ukraine and Russia, let's put it to life. Bring it back to life, because they agreed it before and they signed it. The unfortunate thing was, after they signed that, they signed it in 2015. By the end of 2015, by December, the constitution of Ukraine should have been changed to allow for that. But Ukraine didn't make that happen because they were agitated, they were provoked, and there were a lot of changes that were taking place internally. And that's why all these things didn't happen. And the 4th part of the solution is that Crimea will continue to be part of Russia. And let me reason why I argue that to be the case is this. You remember when Russia invaded Crimea and annexed it, they held 2 independent referendums in Crimea. These 2 independent referendums, 96% and 98% of everyone living in Crimea voted for Crimea to be part of Russia.
Yeah.
And the reason is very simple. There are a lot of ethnic Russians living in Crimea. If you look through the history, in the whole of Russia, in that area, it's the only country that is Mediterranean climate. And if you look at the history, all the previous czars in Russia have their own individual castles. When I visited Crimea many years ago, I visited the place there. I went to the place where Churchill slept and had the negotiations and etc. And Churchill actually offered to buy that castle. And of course, they didn't allow him. There are 2 lions outside at the entrance of that castle. He even offered for the British government to buy the 2 lions, but they didn't want to sell it to him.
Yeah.
They said, since you don't sell it, let me buy only 1. That also they didn't want to. And the point is this, the Russians love Crimea. And so because of that, all the czars have their own private homes, their castles, they spend money on modern infrastructure, everything inside there. So that place was very, very well developed.
Yeah.
And that's why the Crimeans, they all love Russia because it was special treatment given to Crimea. Under those 2 referendums, overwhelmingly the people in Crimea choose to be part of Russia instead of Ukraine. So to my mind, if you forge an agreement to settle the deal, you should simply say, for the sake of the people themselves in Crimea, we should follow the will of the people. They should become part of Russia rather than become part of Ukraine. And so if I step back and ask the question, why would they do this? Why would they agree to this 4 solution? Number one, the first point that I said before, it's a simple thing for NATO to agree not to encroach.
Yeah.
They already agreed that before in 1991. James Baker famously said, not an inch we will move, not an inch. But of course, they went miles after miles and after miles. And so all they need to do is go back to the original intent. And the second point was, Russia must give an unequivocal assurance to Ukraine that they will never, ever invade them. And that's why they wanted to be part of NATO. Because they have dismantled their nuclear armaments and they were totally naked. And so Russia must come unequivocally say, we're not going to invade you.
Yeah.
And if they put it in writing, clearly said, and the rest of the world will absolutely stick around and said, that is ironclad and hardwired agreement, then NATO said, then Ukraine said, okay, we are safe. We don't need to be part of NATO to be protected. So I think they will do it. The third point is about the Minsk agreement. They have already signed that.
Exactly.
Leon. They signed it in 2015. So they signed it before. Just make it happen.
Yeah.
So my idea here is that not a wild idea.
Just invoke that.
Just invoke it. It's not a wild idea. It's not daft. So I think if Donald Trump and his team really examine these 4 points and really put it down, I think there's a solution here, but it requires people who are convincing enough to bring diplomacy and gentlemen, really consummate interlocutors to go and get an agreement around these 4 points.
Tell them nicely to go to hell and give them the directions while you're at it. Yeah. What do you think, though? I mean, obviously, you have pointed out the correct bargaining chips to play. But what do you think Trump's team, what would be their Trump card, if you will?
Well, the Trump card is that they are going to say that if you don't do this, NATO and the US will continue to help Ukraine. And if they were to help Ukraine in many ways, what is most likely going to happen is that he will paint scenario 3, that it will become an intermittent and frozen conflict.
Yeah.
The conflict will persist for a very long time, and this conflict is going to drain Russia of their resources. In time, they will have very little money to keep the economy going, and it's going to be bad for them. So this idea of
The US probably wouldn't mind that
they
scenario,
wouldn't mind
to be
that.
honest.
To be honest, they wouldn't mind that. So this proxy war is actually bad, very bad for Russia. And so that scenario is not good. So I think Trump is going to make it quite clear that if we don't come to the table and agree a deal, more likely scenario 3 will happen. And this is bad for you. You should come out and find a solution to it. And reminding him that don't worry, you will get what you've already secured. And you have signed the Minsk agreement before, the Minsk II agreement. And we find a way around to make sure that becomes alive.
What signal do you think both Putin and Zelensky are trying to set now? Because it seems it's almost too coincidental that you suddenly see things re-escalate again, just as we get news of Trump, winning the White House again. What do you think is going on here?
As soon as Trump won, the first person to call him was Zelensky.
Yeah.
And Putin didn't call him immediately. He immediately went out there and really suggested to him that we can find a way how to do so. The good thing is that they're prepared to talk. The indications are both sides are prepared to talk. Under the Biden administration, nobody was prepared to talk. That was the problem. And because the channel for communication and diplomacy was just broken. They burned the bridges, and that's the problem. When you find Putin and Zelensky, the two of them don't want to talk, this is the problem. And when the two of them don't want to talk, then other people around them who are helping them on both sides also don't want to talk. So the good news is that there seem to be indications they're prepared to talk. But obviously when they talk now, Putin has got the upper hand because he's basically won a lot of territories. Every week he's gaining territories in the Donbas region. A lot of it's under their control. So he's basically saying, I've got this. So because I have this, I then have an upper hand to go and execute this. Of course, Ukraine will find that very difficult. So I think Ukraine will accept the fact that the areas here can become independent states, not become part of Russia. They can be under the influence of Russia, but they shouldn't become part of Russia because it looks like Ukraine had lost. So the Donbas region become independent, or if you like, relative autonomy. They're still part of Ukraine, but I don't think that's accepted to Putin. Putin wouldn't buy that. Yeah. Putin wouldn't buy because he already has it.
Correct.
Because he's already secured it. Why would I give it up? But I think to come for independence, that the whole area become independent. And so I think the idea of, it seems that the reports are suggesting that Trump and his people are saying, why don't we take the whole area and call it a neutral zone to be policed by, let's say, United Nations.
Yeah.
And to make sure that's being policed, then I think then you can do solutions like that.
Yeah. I mean, it is promising.
Find a solution.
Yeah. It is promising because, like you say, both parties have expressed a willingness to talk about it, to come to the table. But also, before we recorded this, we were just observing all of the recent airstrikes and the fact that none of these airstrikes had been in any way proximate to the respective leaders.
Yeah.
So obviously they're not playing a game of trying to delete their counterpart or delete their rival. Yeah. It's simply, for lack of a better term, it just seems it's a bit of a dick measuring competition. Unlike what we see Netanyahu doing.
Oh yeah. Netanyahu.
The situation in Israel is
they're killing
ruthless.
All the Palestinian and all the Hezbollah leaders one by one. They just delete them one by one. Yeah. But they have not. I mean, if the same, playbook was used in the Ukraine-Russian war, you'd imagine that the first thing that the attackers were used, they would have sent them out to try and kill each other, both sides. But I mean, the report suggested that 6 of them were deployed in the heart of Russia, but they were zeroed into military targets. But they were certainly not sent to Putin's residence.
Yeah.
And so they were focusing on that. But reports from the Russians suggested that they have intercepted 5 of them. One had hit the target though. But everything is going on today. But I mean, you can see that that Biden had allowed them to use it. When he was the G20 meeting in Brazil, he said now his runway is very short for him. And he had, up to now, he had said, no, do not use it other than only for your protection for only the Donbas region, not into the depth of Russia. But he had now allowed it to happen. So that's why they're deploying it. But his time is running out for him.
Let's bring it a bit closer to home now. And let's, I'm curious, what are some of the learnings from the stuff that we have talked about? And how can we maybe apply them? How can we allow for cooler heads to prevail in the face of our more day-to-day conflicts and challenges, whether it's at home, whether it's at work, or even at school?
Yeah. Well, the first lesson learned is that if you promise something, whether it's in writing and verbal, honor it. That's very important in leadership. And if you tell someone clearly and unequivocally, people expect you to honor it. And if you say it unequivocally in front of everybody, they expect you to honor it. So that's one. The second thing is this, always look for win-win, not a zero-sum game. Because the way these guys were looking at this is zero-sum game. On a zero-sum game, NATO want to encroach. And I know you're not happy, Russia, but I'm just going to do it because I have an open door. Whoever comes to me, I enlarge. So I win, and I win. It's zero-sum game.
Yeah.
So
manage the polarity, something that you talk about a lot.
Absolutely. So I think that is key. And the third one is managing polarities. Things that you cannot solve. Learn to find compromises. Because you are not going to get everything the way you want. You have to compromise. You win some and you lose some. Be prepared to trade off. So if you're prepared to trade off, this is what Zelensky has to learn to trade off. He must accept the fact that the will of the people in Crimea, majority of them have voted for it to be part of Russia. And if you don't believe it, let UN people go and conduct a referendum. Do it one more time, independent. And then I think I wouldn't be surprised the outcome is exactly the same.
Yeah.
And so I think he must be prepared to say, okay, I accept that. Accept that and allow it to happen. And rather than provoke the Russians, when they, so I think it's very, very important that they need to do this. In the same way as Putin must learn to lose some as well. For example, he's annexed all this, they become part of his now. To get peace in that region, he should say, okay, I'm not going to take them part of Russia, I allow them to be independent.
Yeah.
I return them to you, but they're not part of you now, they should become independent. All the Donbas regions are independent and they're governed by themselves. For me, if Putin is actually man enough, he should come out and say to them, never mind, they can be part of Russia or Ukraine, but they become relative autonomy. So we can control them a little bit here. So I think that is totally possible, relative autonomy.
For you personally, what has been the biggest, since you talked about coming to a compromise, what would you say has been your biggest compromise professionally in the interest of coming to an agreement?
Let me pause there. What would be the biggest compromise? When I was in Sri Lanka, Shell bought 51% equity in Shell Gas Lanka Limited. And when we paid a premium for it, Shell, we paid a premium to have a monopoly. So a compromise was to allow us to increase the price beyond the legislated price, ceiling price that the government had put there, that we had to give up the monopoly. That's a compromise. Bringing in competition. So I had to argue with the rest of the group. We must give a compromise here. That's one compromise. The second compromise was we do an open tender. This was seen as completely unacceptable to the group, Shell Group, because they said, how can we go and buy from Exxon or a third party and not from our own refineries? But that was a compromise that we have to take, because if we don't take this compromise, the government is not going to allow us to increase price. If the government does not allow us to increase price, we will never be able to make money in Shell Sri Lanka, because the price that the government put for selling our LPG was lower than product cost. So the cost to produce is higher than the actual selling price. Obviously, we will never make money. And so that was a compromise for us to go and do that. When we went out there, Leon, as a result of that, during my time in Sri Lanka, 50% of our LPG, we bought them from a Swiss company, Petrodec, because their offer for LPG was exactly the same as Shell, $51 a ton, contract price, CP. And that was exactly the same. So we signed a deal for 5-year agreement that 50% of our source of our LPG came from Petrodec, 50% came from Shell. And that was a compromise. And it was difficult at that time. It's very difficult for us to do it. But in life, Leon, you have to win some and lose some.
Yeah, to win some and lose some. And I think it would be a good way to close is just by this quote from former Ukrainian president, actually, Leonid Kuchma, who said very profoundly that peace requires painful compromises,
right?
But war demands everything.
Absolutely.
So the little quick sting of a bit of a compromise is far better than the prolonged ache of trying to go at war with one another.
Absolutely.
And I think that's a great reminder, not just for world leaders, but for all of us in our day-to-day, to try to be open to compromise in the interest of peace. Well, great place to end today's podcast, and safe travels tomorrow to London. To the rest of you, thank you for listening to yet another episode. Thank you for watching. We hope you've enjoyed this conversation. If you like what you've heard, if this is your first time listening and you have not subscribed, we encourage you, please do subscribe to both our YouTube as well as Spotify. We also upload short form content on IG and TikTok at The Game of Impossible. Thank you for joining us, and we'll see you next week.